So, some of the messages that just are so baked into our society, the first thing that's coming to mind is how often we apologize for our tears or for any disruption. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was crying, or I'm sorry. And that is just such a norm that we don't even notice that we literally apologize for having a normal human experience. Welcome to Grief Heals, the podcast that explores how grief heals. Join us as we consider how grief invites love within ourselves, our communities, our world, our histories, and how it is that grief heals. I'm Lisa Michelle Zega here with Eric Simpson.
Part of that is that people are uncomfortable, including myself, when another person is showing extreme emotion. If somebody's crying, if it makes me uncomfortable, I may want to shut it down in some way and get them to feel better so that they'll
Yeah.
stop. And
Yeah.
and so I guess maybe one of the questions we're asking is, why does it make us feel uncomfortable? Or why do people feel uncomfortable, and what kinds of ideas or concepts are we adhering to that causes that kind of discomfort?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things coming to mind, but it is so pervasive that it's like we treat the natural as unnatural. So like having a human response is to
Mhm.
whatever sadness is so natural, and yet we've been conditioned in some kind of way to think that it's wrong or bad with messages like, well, if you're going to be sad alone. So why do you think that is?
Well, when we turn on the television and watch a television commercial or read an ad in a magazine, we usually don't see the selling point being sadness. The selling point is, this product is going to make you happy. Whatever I have to sell you is going to make you happy. And so we've been bombarded with this over and over and over and over again throughout our entire lives as individuals and as a culture. Consumerism in a capitalist society promotes the idea not only of ever expanding growth with no limit, unlimited resources, as well as the fulfillment of the fulfillment of whatever the product is that is being sold is our happiness. It's going to bring us pleasure, or it's going to make us happy. And so that becomes the ideal for us.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me because that is like the message. What it ends up creating is this idea that sadness is wrong or bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like because the goal is to get past it. The goal is to use this product so that you don't have to have that human experience. And what's fascinating, I've been reading this book, How to Be Sad, and one of the things she does is looks at the cultural landscape in other regions, right? Whether it's with other tribes, other civilizations in Russia, in Asia, like just this more pervasive look at things. And in the UK and in the US, there seems to be this adversarial relationship with sadness, like we're at war with it. It must be overcome, it must be conquered.
Right.
Whereas that's not the case worldwide.
Yeah, it would be possible, I think, to set up a false dichotomy here as well, like an either or, where
Yeah.
I think it's possible to be exist in a way in which we integrate our suffering possibly into our lives, or not just our suffering, but our grief and our sadness, which are natural human responses to conditions that we're in. If we integrate those in a way to which we can still be content, or still be, even amidst extreme difficulties, have the ability to experience suffering and transfigure it at the same time. And that transfiguration and that experience brings about a multifaceted emotional realm in which we can be joyful and unhappy, or those aren't opposites at the
No,
same time.
And that is that's part of the fallout of this idea of creating it like an either or. Either I'm happy or I'm sad. I think circling back to this discomfort that we opened with, I think that's part of the thing is because we've got it positioned as it's like on this continuum, sadness being on one side and happiness being on the other, and the goal to move away from sadness to get to happy, and this either or of like either I'm happy or I'm sad. But yet that's not really the human experience. And I think the discomfort comes from, no, if I'm sad, that means I can't be happy. And now I'm jeopardizing this goal for my life or something along those lines, when in fact they meet. Happiness and sadness live inside me at one and the same time. Like, I am so happy that my boys are growing and individuating and having this life of their own. And there's a sadness of losing them as boys that wanted their mom,
Mhm.
that were dependent on me in some kind of way. And like both get to exist in my reality.
Right. And some of this is tied up in desire as well, because you desire for your boys to do well and to be healthy.
Yes.
And if your desire is truncated, that can cause sadness or grief. I'm also wondering how, though, consumerism and our experience in a culture that is built upon the values of consumerism present to us an ideal of happiness that might be misdefined in some ways, might not really be happiness. I mean, a lot of times it's pleasure that's being sold, and that's not the same thing as happiness.
Yeah, and you had mentioned the word content,
Mhm.
right? And I'm thinking about the interplay between happiness and contentment. And the other thing coming to mind is we are constantly seeing people that have achieved what's being offered, achieving all the accolades of society or wealth or the ability to have all that is desired,
Mhm.
who are miserable.
But they seem happy on some level. We think they're happy.
Yeah, and I'm it's almost confusing to me
Mhm.
that we compartmentalize that. Like, in other words, we don't seem to make the connection because that still is so pervasive that no, 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 I need to go and achieve something outside of myself for this elusive happiness, but that it like the goalpost keeps moving. Well, I got this, but of course I'm not happy because, and then I don't have, and then the
Right.
goalpost moves yet again. There's also this thing of I can't be happy in the journey. I can only be happy in the attainment. And
Right.
that seems to also help with the goalpost moving.
I agree with you. For a lot of people, including myself at times, the one you think one thing is going to make you happy, and then you achieve it or you get it, and then you're not happy. You might be excited, or anyway, once you get it, you just look on to something else because that didn't work. And that's a very common thing. I'm not an expert in Buddhism, but I know that there's a concept called comparing mind. And comparing mind is when we compare ourselves. Usually it's used and when we compare ourselves with the success and happiness of other people. And this happens a lot, I think, in social media, like Facebook. You might look back at your high school friends and maybe they're all successful and they own 7 houses, and maybe one's a movie star and another one's a politician. That makes a lot of people feel like they're failures, and that causes unease and grief and unhappiness that rises from the desire to have what they seem to have. So it's based on the spectacle of your friends and acquaintances. But it can even happen, in your own neighborhood. Like the neighbor across the street has a new Porsche or something, and you think that's what will make you happy. So that desire is born in you as well.
Well, and the advertising that you mentioned, I mean, it plays on that.
Mhm.
Like all these images, there's so many pharmaceutical commercials, and it doesn't matter really what they're saying the side effects are. The
Mhm.
images that are being shown to the brain are laughter and, like this dancing and this whimsical, like everything has arrived and we are so happy.
Right.
And I'm just thinking about the disconnect between the actual human experience and how it plays out where we think that sadness is wrong.
Mhm.
Like the end game is to eradicate sadness, even though it's a common thread in human existence. When I was looking at my daughter in law, like fully ripe with child and anticipating my granddaughter, there was a joy that I was experiencing and an emptiness. And I felt like this sense of I needed to be able to justify the emptiness I felt in my heart. The next day when the kids were gone and I woke up all by myself and I went for a walk, that emptiness was like gnawing at me and I felt like there was something wrong with me. Oh, me who is constantly in the realm of grief, right?
Mhm.
And I remember I began tapping on my collarbone, just arriving in my body. And I said, "You don't have to justify your sadness, Lisa. You do not have to justify your sadness." Something happened and I crumbled into the street, like just sobbing, sobbing, Eric. It was early morning. I was by myself and I just let myself cry for no reason. When I got home, it was almost like I recognized, oh, there's a connection. There's a connection between this new life growing in my daughter in law and who I wanted to be for my kids. And whatever I think that my daughter in law, my grandbaby is going to experience because of what my kids experienced, my son in particular, her father was going to experience, like that she was going to experience because of the kind of mom that I was. And I don't know, there's a both and in there. And something about embracing that fullness of my own human experience has created a freedom of embracing my new grandbaby. And also the idea that part of her life will hold suffering. Like the goal is not to alleviate any form of pain for my children or my grandkids. And like that's an impossible goal.
I was thinking about that just a few days ago, that it is impossible to, and I really want to protect my kids, and I don't want them to ever feel any pain. I don't want them to ever suffer. And that's completely irrational and not realistic and doesn't help them at all. Everybody needs to grow, but I'm not going to try to cause them pain or cause them to suffer, because that would be, I mean, there are people I think that would do that. And that's ludicrous to me. You don't want to be an agent of chaos and suffering and unhappiness. However, learning how to accept our own suffering and accept the fact that everyone suffers enables me to relate to my children on a human level, and that we all suffer and we all suffer together. So when they are going to suffer, I'll be there to suffer with them in as much as that is possible. That's not always going to be possible. They're going to live their own lives and have their own suffering. But when we accept the reality of suffering and bring our attention to it and bring our attention to the suffering in other people, then we are brought to a place where we can be in communion, and suffering becomes as a basis of our shared reality and our shared communion with each other.
I'm having an awareness of what you're saying about the communion with ourselves, with each other, and being with our kids and our suffering. Like after that happened, that meaning me crumpling in the
Mhm.
street, and I'm sure it was a for an onlooker, it's not like I was in the street for a long time. Maybe this lasted 15 seconds, but I let myself be overcome such that my body was folded, right?
Mhm.
What ended up happening is it was the catalyst for me to start writing a book. What I recognized is there were no villains in my story. So part of the villain of my own story had been myself. I didn't like the mom that I was. I didn't have a ton of compassion on the suffering that created that, right?
Mhm.
And then I had a tendency to want to blame my own mom
Mhm.
for not engaging her suffering in such a way as to help alleviate it from me. When I started writing, the book is in very much rough draft, but what began happening is for the next 3 months, I was just writing every single day about my life story with this lens of compassion for me, for my mom, for my all the players in my story that I was remembering. And sending love to myself and my own story was like also me sending love to my son, my daughter-in-law, and this baby that was growing, inside my daughter-in-law. I say was because she's since been born. But I wanted to be able to embrace her without the tiredness of so much shame around my failure as a mother. And it was still there. And now it's almost like I shed a layer of skin. I shed the illusion that I could ever protect my kids from all the suffering of this world. And like you said, no, even the pain that I inflicted, I was not inflicting it to make them better people.
Right.
But my mothering is part of their journey, and my failure as a mom is part of their journey.
I wonder if writing about the conditions or the circumstances that bring about some of the emotions that you're experiencing and bringing attention to the people in your life and to your own feelings. If did you find that that was cathartic or that was helpful or therapeutic in any way?
Oh my goodness. There are people in my history that, friends that love me think of as villains. I found myself holding not just me, but those individuals and people from my ancestry. And you know what's so wild? Yes. So the short answer is so cathartic. I don't understand how it's like I am holding other humans alongside myself all the way back to the beginning of time, if that's such a thing, with such love and compassion and understanding while not condoning, excusing, or justifying harm done to others. But there's something incredibly magical about that, mystical, beautiful. Like you use this language of transfiguration. I'm communing with my ancestors. I'm communing with people that are still alive, but not in my life in this mystical way because being with my own suffering has transfigured how I am with them and with their suffering. And it's transfigured how I am with my future, like how I interact with my future self and the future for my granddaughter. And I would say that it's all infused with this hope and love and joy that does not eliminate the fact that I know that I'm going to face more suffering. I
Mhm.
know that because everyone and everything that I love will die, and my kids are going to experience suffering. And yet I have such an immense level of communion.
Right. I think there's a sense in which and I don't understand this enough to talk about it at length, but we derive our own personhood from being in communion with everyone and with everything. And the reason I say that is because part of being a human person is responding to things that responding to our losses with grief and
Yeah.
responding to the losses of others with grief and mourning for others. And on that basis, we are in communion. And that communion helps us to be who we are as human beings.
It also helps us to embrace joy and
Mhm.
celebration and laughter, and like it is so not the either or.
Right.
It's really this full expression of togetherness.
In talking about our experiences, there are some days when I'm feeling this and it's working and I'm conscious. There are other days when I'm not, when I'm feeling resentful towards several people. So it's not like this is a linear process. 30 years ago, when I had a conversion experience to Christianity, we'd give our testimonies, and there'd be this very linear story of how I was like this and that. And then all of a sudden I was born again, and now I'm like, everything's fine. There's nothing like that in life. Every process takes time and is not linear or delineated in a way that we can easily say, well, here's the crux where I changed and now I'm a different person. But we are processes as people, and the process is a daily experience. It's a moment by moment experience. So there may be times when I'm avoiding grief, and there are other times when I'm accepting it. And there are times when I don't want to suffer, and there are times when I'm open to experiencing that suffering because of what it has to teach me, or because it's just there and I can't avoid it.
You know, I love that you said that, and there's a few things in my own experience just responding to that. Like one, as we mature, we have a different relationship to the grief. Like it might be more prevalent to us what was lost,
Right, right.
right? And so we could look very, very similar. Our experience could be very similar. There is a picture behind me of a tree going through all the seasons, right? And that is a process. It's a living process, and it continues to happen year upon year upon year. And yet the tree is maturing and growing year upon year upon year. These things move in us in cycles. And then another thing in nature, we know of hibernation. There are times where we're drawing in and alone and hibernating. And like there is a complexity of both and not either or. And no, it is not linear. I think that is part of what we're talking about, this message and culture that we're supposed to be unnatural, that there are not meant to be rhythms, that things shouldn't look the way they've looked in the past, that we're ever to be moving away, growing further and further away from what was. That's
That's great.
simply not, it's not exemplified in nature.
I mean, that you bring up a great point, I think, which is that we change our relationship to suffering and to grief. And we do change, and we do experience, we do develop new skills and we learn how to live more skillfully. But that doesn't mean we become experts at grieving, or that we're never
No.
gonna that we're gonna do it right every time.
And I mean, that's even the point of telling the story about my grandchild. Like, I am a woman whose life is characterized by grief and being with grievers. And like, I was wanting to reject my own experience. The story I'm telling you is that this is not even a 6-month-old story. For me, it became very important to recognize no, the work I do in the world does not exempt me from the process.
I mean, some of the things that we've been enculturated with to tell ourselves or to tell other people when we experience suffering or loss or grief may still come up for people who know the importance of grieving. And we may find ourselves tempted to tell other people, like if somebody's experienced loss and they're grieving, tell them things like, well, just give it time. Time itself will heal all your suffering, or, don't cry. It'll be okay. You'll find somebody else.
We try to hide our suffering from our children. We all intuit other people's energy, we feel it. So when we're saying, hey, what's wrong? We're saying that because intuitively we know
Mhm.
something is off. And then when we lie to each other So lying to our kids and say, oh, nothing's wrong, mommy's fine. Now we're teaching our own kids to not trust their intuition. It's so wild that these messages that they don't just exist in a vacuum without consequence. What we're doing to try to help ends up hurting when we're saying, don't be sad. And yet I am sad. What we end up telling people is your experience is wrong.
Right.
So now not only am I sad, I feel bad for being sad. Or when we say you'll meet someone new, again, this message of it is not okay to suffer, and yet I am suffering. And yet suffering is part of life. We unintentionally bake in a greater suffering than the suffering that it is being experienced. Like none of us would tell our kids, hey, don't trust yourself.
I would tell my kids, notice what you're feeling, notice what you're thinking. Not necessarily everything you feel or think is correct or right.
Absolutely.
There are cognitive distortions and things like that can
Yeah.
derail us.
Right. And we don't ignore it. We simply say, notice.
Right.
And that becomes a path of healing for ourselves, is to notice what we're feeling, to allow it. We're going to have judgments about it. We're going to have labels on it. We're going to have all these things. Notice those too. And as best as we can, return to the present moment.
I find that that's very helpful for me, or has been, in a really weird way, because it's not like an ultimate type thing, but it's just like a moment by moment thing when I've been experiencing loss and extreme difficulty and stress. No matter what the circumstance is, if I just begin to notice very simple things like the experience of breathing or of the world around me, and of just existence, of living in this existence, and how I take it for granted when it's actually really awesome to be a sensate person. It's amazing. And this isn't like comparing that to my suffering and saying, well, I shouldn't feel my suffering because look how awesome experience is. It's just saying that in the middle of my suffering, when I notice and bring attention just to the wonder and amazement that is imbued within existence itself, that brings some sense of clarity. Not clarity in the sense of I know everything, but clarity in the sense of all these negative thoughts I'm having are not necessarily true. I thought of a book called The Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in which he talks about a character who is in the Gulag and is suffering Soviet oppression, but he takes simple pleasure in a cigarette. And that's sort of a funny thing because, we know cigarettes cause cancer and that type of thing, but just having that cigarette, that one thing, that one moment of enjoyment for him makes all the difference. Even when I bring attention, I have thought at times of, well, this is Denisovich, this is his cigarette that I'm experiencing. I'm going to smoke that cigarette right now. I'm just going to notice how thrilling it is to be able to feel things, to feel textures, and to just be alive. Just, even if all of my senses are in pain or are suffering the loss of someone that I love dearly, and I'm no longer going to be able to see them physically. Being in the Gulag was harsh and difficult. So is life. But we can take these moments of attention and love just for being alive. And that helps me anyway to make it moment by moment through periods of intense grief and suffering. You've been listening to Grief Heals with Lisa Michelle Zega. The podcast is produced by me, Eric Simpson, in association with Jump Up and Down Productions. Music by Ken Delian, Drunken Nights to Sunday Mornings, and Stefan Carlin, A Calming Ocean, A Common Notion. If you would like more information about the work Lisa does, point your browsers to legityou.com. That's LEGITYOU. Lisa can also be reached at Lisa Michelle at legitu.com. This has been a Jump Up and Down production.